The Earthcare Fieldcast, a show about how we build collective power across ecology and care. Hi and welcome to the Earthcare Fieldcast episode 5, where we will be talking about the politics of clandestine food production in Italy.
We talked to Andrea Gelfi about GeniunoClandestino, a network that he's been a part of for some years now. Andrea is a super interesting person to talk to because he's not only an olive farmer in Tuscany, where we talked to him, but he's also a researcher, an intellectual, and a long-term activist in different social movements, including in the social center movement in Italy. GeniunoClandestino is different from some of the peasant and agroecological movements that we've been hearing about in the past, for instance, La Via Campesina Romania in episode 2, in that it's mostly composed of new peasant farmers who are embracing this kind of identity, but not in a particularly traditionalist way, and trying to weave networks with urban struggles. Many of these people come from urban settings. Many of these people come from political movements in the cities, which means that they are doing things that continue the politics that they were involved in before. For instance, migrant solidarity, supporting social centers, and so on. So in this interview with Andrea, we're going to be hearing about what is it that's clandestine about GeniunoClandestino. We're going to be talking about this more about the social composition of this movement, the kind of institutional challenges that they're facing, and we're going to talk about what they think about agroecology and care. And I'm also going to be asking Andrea to talk a little bit about the broader perspective that he sees as a researcher and an activist in the ecological movement within Italy.
GeniunoClandestino emerged in 2010 in Bologna out of a link between social centers, autonomous movements, and peasant farmers looking for ways to sell their produce and push to change laws restricting them from selling their produce. And we will hear about how that process of pushing to change legal frameworks has been successful in some regions in Italy. So what is really interesting about this movement is that it both subverts and makes fun of existing laws by selling so-called genuinely clandestine products, but also works to change existing legal frameworks in the directions of the commons and of agroecology.
So basically, GeniunoClandestino is a network. If you go on the GeniunoClandestino website, you will see the manifesto, a manifesto that connects different points in thinking together agroecology, the invention of rural forms of living, the invention of guarantee participatory system, the centrality of the market, and many, many other. It's an anti-fascist, anti-sexist, and anti-racist group. So let's say the political dispositive of GeniunoClandestino was, in the last 10 years, constructing our own space of mutual aid amongst us, amongst farmers and peasants, and construct our own way to create new connection, cultural, material, but also economical, between the countryside or a certain way of living in the countryside and the urban spaces. Sometimes it's more about more protected spaces as social centers, because, police are not allowed to come and nor the health officer of the state, so it's easier to make a self-organized process. Sometimes the battle was a bit more ambitious to do the same thing, but in the public plaza, not in protected space, but for being more visible, more in connection with common people, more related with different association, political and cultural events in certain neighborhood, in certain cities, more connected with a territory also in the urban space. Also because I have to say, when you organize a farmers market, it's not only that you take some farmers from the mountains and say, okay, come here and do your own stuff. You need to build the legitimacy and the cultural consensus in the city of that. And this is very an activist-based making of things that demand you to connect, to have strong relation with people living in the countryside for whom it matters that kind of practice. So it's not given in a way, that you open a farmer market and it works. And
one thing that might be useful to kind of unpack is the name itself. So
GeniunoClandestino, very nice story. GeniunoClandestino started as a disobedience/communication campaign. So basically, We are back in Bologna because it's the place where it started with a national meeting. We are back in Bologna at Campiaperti, later became Campiaperti, but I mean the germinal thing. I mean, was just 4 people in a bar selling vegetable in a social center. So a very tiny things, but immediately very deeply connected with movements in the city. This is very significant for the future of Campiaperti. Now they have 8 weekly markets in the city, so it's a strong economy, and they have involved more than 160 farmers. So it's a big thing. They are making irreversible the presence of food networks. I mean, peasant food networks in the city. This is a big thing. I mean, it's something that they are there. I was mentioning that when in Bologna, around 2008, they feel the necessity to make the jump from social center to the public plaza, but also the products. Many products were illegal simply because, especially in Italy, we call them trasformati. So it's when you make from tomatoes a tomato sauce, or from an apricot a marmalade. This transformation, no? You are transforming food. There, all the standards and the regulations of that are made in relation to the standards of the food industry. So basically, if you are a small farmers, as we are supposed to be the health and the sanitary system and the places where you produce the process of transformation, which is aligned with the standard, I mean the hygienic standard of the multinational of food production. So it doesn't make any sense for 1 million reasons. So these products were illegal, and the campaign was, okay, let's put the logo here, GeniunoClandestino. So this is clandestine, and also, I mean, the resonance was strong with the economy of migration wave. They have been very difficult years in Italy. I mean, Lega Nord was emerging, also the rhetoric against migration. You are clandestino, no? You remember? Yeah. Okay, in that context was also a way to resonate with another very important everyday autonomous struggle, clandestino. But there is also the clandestino of being clandestino of a product, so totally illegal, but genuino. And the campaign was, okay, we tell to everybody that what we are doing is illegal, but for us it's very good. So we are making an argument and a product and a very material thing outside the law, but there is a community and a self-organization process that make it relevant for other people. So it was strong, I have to say. It was a very strong campaign. And still, I think the very strong imaginary potential of GeniunoClandestino is strictly connected with that way of saying, okay, we are making visible ourselves through a campaign, and we are arguing through that, saying, okay, we have to change the law because the law is wrong. And after that, for example, I was deeply involved, and we won actually in local regulation in the region of Tuscany in the previous legislation, in the previous way. I mean, now there is another political composition of Tuscany, the political level, but just 3 years before, I was deeply involved in writing the new law about the right of food transformation in Tuscany, and now there is this possibility.
Okay, so it's no longer clandestine in Tuscany.
It's no longer clandestine, the food. Sometimes it's clandestine, the producer. Mm-hmm. So there are still contadino de facto in all GeniunoClandestino markets in all around the country. But the right of making, for example, now I'll show you, we have a small vineyard. The way in which we will be able in 1 year time to make our own canteen will never possible without the law that I wrote with other farmers and politicians, but now it will be possible because we have a new standard for peasants, for small farmers.
So canteen is the wine production at the farm, right? That's
the place in which you process the grape.
So at this point in the interview, it's maybe good to give a little bit of background on this context where GeniunoClandestino arose, or rather Campi Aperti, which was before 2002. It was a context of the older globalization movement and the very strong at this time Italian social center scene, which is connected to the long tradition of autonomous movements in Italy. And of course, these movements have a notion of class autonomy and of kind of fighting state restrictions on the collective freedom of people and the commons to build new institutions and to produce new social relations, including producing the relations that are involved in setting up farmers' markets that provide good and affordable food for working class people in the city, for young people, etc. But there's also something about the economics of agricultural production that's important to understand here, because what Andrea is mentioning is the kind of clandestine food, what he calls transformed food, or we can say processed food, which could be something like tomato sauce, jam that he's mentioning, and so on, is a really significant part of the economic sustainability of agricultural production. Because if you're a small garden farmer, peasant farmer, and you're producing something and you're allowed to sell that as raw fruits, raw vegetables in the market, but if you're not allowed to transform the produce that you cannot sell in the market into other products, like tomato sauce from unsold tomatoes, it means that produce will go to waste. And that, of course, makes your production a lot less sustainable, economically speaking. And it's also a great disadvantage to industrial farmers who are able to sell that access to industrial processing of tomato sauce in this case. As we'll hear later, these kinds of politics are quite specific on a regional basis in Italy. And this is the context in which Andrea is talking about being part of writing a new law on the level of the region of Tuscany that allows this kind of production.
So the GeniunoClandestino takes its starting point in the question of processed food and who is allowed to sell processed foods. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, processed food is an important part of it. Another important part of it is the right to set up farmers' markets, which they started doing in social centers, which have a strong tradition in Italy of defending themselves from state inspection, from the police. So there's this question of the right of peasants to autonomously set up markets as well.
Sometimes, of course, GeniunoClandestino, it's a community of practices first. So inside you have very different political understanding and feelings. Okay, maybe amongst the peasant and farmers movement in Italy, it's sometimes thought as the most radical because full of people maybe coming from urban spaces and connected with autonomous movements or anarchist movement or social centers, that kind of stuff. But then in the real shaping of the processes, more practice-based than other things. For example, GeniunoClandestino, I think, still they have, I don't know, very significant practices to show and very strong everyday practices. The GeniunoClandestino has a strong logo and capacity to create imagination of living otherwise. This is very strong, but in political terms, it's very weak, both in communicative term, in organizing a communication, and also in the level of organization, because each knot is deeply independent, and it's all the time very difficult to make a statement together.
Okay.
Yeah. It's deeply, well, I will say federalist, but it's not true, because sometimes the federation is difficult to make, except from the 2-3 days, 2 times a year. So,
and putting out illegal products must have resulted in some kind of repression from the state, from the authorities that oversee food security standards and so on. Wait, how has that played out?
No, well, okay, this is very dishomogeneous territory for territory. For example, we had many fines in Florence, and we use also fines for make politics. squatted squares after the fine to say, okay, we are doing this publicly. We ask to the municipality to cancel the fine. So here becomes a part of contentious politics. In Bologna, when the movement started, was more, okay, we are doing this step in which way we protect ourselves or translate a possible weakness in a weapon, being offensive and creative in a way. But there was fines, for example, because the movement was strong enough and the public authorities say, okay, let them do whatever they are doing. It's not convenient for us, making a repressive dimension. But this is very dishomogeneous territory by territory, and Genuino Clandestino in itself takes different shapes, territory. It's very dishomogeneous at the national level.
How would you characterize the social composition of this network or this movement, which is again heterogeneous, I'm sure? So what are the different components that go into this, and how are they? What are the methods through which they're composed politically?
Yeah. Okay, it's clear in Genuino Clandestino, but I can do the same for many other groups or experiences that don't recognize themselves in a group. I rarely met a person who grown up in a farm. They are all coming from urban experience or maybe rural but not connected with the land. I mean, small villages. Italy is a country full of small villages but not necessarily connected with the life of food or the life of the land. So there is this ingredient. It's really, I think, 99% people that for maybe different reasons and in different waves, at certain moment of their life, they decided to go to the countryside and make something like a farm or something like that, and overlap in a very significant way their way of living and eating and selling food and connecting self-subsistence in an economical and also in non-economical term, committed with ecological care. This is very strong. I mean, this is a strong ethos. But this is, I have to say, what I'm saying is true for Genuino Clandestino, but I have to say it's true for also many other people that don't recognize themselves for many reasons in Genuino Clandestino, but are involved in this back to the land wave. Yeah, in Italy at least.
So you mentioned the very strong resonance of the term clandestino with the question of the autonomy of migration, migrant solidarity, and so on. And you mentioned that Genuino Clandestino is anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc. So I'm curious whether that leads into any kinds of alliances with the movements that fight along those issues.
Yeah. Well, there are many examples, but examples coming also from contingency situations. No, for example, in Bologna, the food of the peasants. There was. Now I don't remember exactly. It will be 5 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that. A very, very, very important big squat situation for the right of the house. That was 90% migrants people, very connected with the workers struggling in the logistics sector in Bologna. And Genuino Clandestino Bologna, Campi Aperti, organized in the squatted cortile internal area a market, and all the accidents was giving them food. Or when there was a very intense moment of struggle for the right of migration in Ventimiglia, the border between Italy and France, it was 8-9 years ago. So also there we had different waves, but a very significant moment of struggle there. Peasants and farmers of Genuino Clandestino Bologna, in connection with No Border activists and other groups in Bologna, give them their own food in order to make a kitchen there in solidarity with them. So it's part of many experience and specific moment, and in general, I mean, it's not. We are not already there, but in Genuino Clandestino, clearly there is the idea that we have to arrive to the right to buy good food, agroecological food for everyone, not only for middle class or upper class people. It's still object of struggle. We are not already there, but I mean, it's part of the idea, no? Good food for everyone, rather than makes the organic a little niche of market just for certain kind of people, or completely exposed to the market criteria that give you the right to the food or no, and which kind of food. And so it's part of the common feeling, let's say. I mean, I just mentioned these couple of examples because are the first coming in my mind, but yeah, I mean, I think Clandestino, okay, there was this resonance. The resonance of Genuino Clandestino is with autonomy of migration, but also with many, many other struggles, because a bit let's say, the political belonging of the most part of the people, also before going back to the farm, very often it's very connected with the long durée, the long tradition of social movement history that shape a bit the formation of many different generations in the university or in the social center or in the urban spaces.
I think this is super interesting in the sense that the context that Andrea speaks from tells us of an anti-racist struggle that starts from a very different place than the ones that we have heard of previously in our fieldcast. We have heard, for instance, from the point of view of traditional family peasant farmers in Romania, their struggles as seasonal agricultural workers exploited as migrant workforce. We have heard from Jornaleras de Huelva and different campaigns in Austria and Spain of the plights of seasonal and day labor-based agricultural workers in the industrial system. And here we are seeing an anti-racist struggle that starts from yet another movement, which is the one of migrant and refugee solidarity, which we haven't heard so much about in the past, yet covers another really important part of that spectrum of anti-racist struggle. Just let me finish one thing. And that question of anti-racist struggle and that question of an anti-racist dimension of agricultural-based struggle is really key for imagining food production within a horizon of a politics of care, because there cannot be any politics of care if many are systematically excluded and exploited. So the politics of care is also always about asking who is here, who is missing, and how can we stand in solidarity.
These kinds of stories are also really important in order to break with the stereotype of peasants and rural movements as being conservative, backward, nationalist, and as a response to the often, of course, provincial politics of right-wing reaction. And one of the kind of ways that this is stereotyped is in this return invocation of the kind of Nazi obsession with the soil and the blood. And here with the migration is like really fighting against the idea of belonging, having anything to do with blood. Belonging is about also arriving and becoming a part of something, becoming a part of solidarities in a place. And the relation to the soil is also something different. It's not soil in the sense of a kind of mythological possession of a people. It's soil as an ecology that has multiple kinds of life in itself that you have to care for, that you have to care with, and this is why this is where we open to the question of agroecology, and agroecology not just as something that has an ecological relation to the soil, but also that is a starting point of forming another social ecology in which another form of life becomes possible on the land.
Well, the word agroecology is very used within GeniunoClandestino in contrapposition first with agro-industry, agribusiness, and the commercial, grande distribuzione organizzata, we say in Italy, no? The network of food supplier and distribution and supermarkets. So it's many used as an antagonistic dimension in relation with that long network of food production. I have to say what is a peculiar thing of GeniunoClandestino is connecting strongly the word agroecology with the word peasant, the active reclaiming of the word peasant. So in GeniunoClandestino, I think in an explicit way, and it's not always the case in the farmers movement in Italy or also abroad, there is a strong connection between agroecology and the reinvention of rural forms of life, of a practicability of life. And there are also nice researches on that now coming out in the last years, and but you feel it. I mean, I feel it. There is this way of dealing with agroecology, and of course, then you have many differences in relation with. Certain knots of GeniunoClandestino are making also good alliances on soil research. So there is an understanding of the relation between scientists, ecologists. Other not and other people are a bit more, okay, we have to come back to a glorious past of the peasants, we have all the knowledge, and the vernacular knowledge makes things better than science, so you have a bit all everything of that. There is an understanding that being a peasant and taking part of this kind of movement is part of a global struggle. There is, definitely. But if I have to say something specific of GeniunoClandestino, is this active reclaiming of this very ancient word, which is contadini, peasant, in a meaning which is definitely different than what contadino was in the last centuries. No, here the word contadini is synonymous with a sort of secession or exit from the economic, material, social, cultural, and political idea of productivism. Being a contadino is the opposite in their mind, in the way in which they use the word, of being an entrepreneur of the land. And this carries at the core of this, no, You are a contadino if you are taking care of the context in which you are, if you make a coexistence between the necessity of having food and spread food and the good wealth of the context, the ecosystem context in which you are. This is in GeniunoClandestino, definitely is there.
So this is peasant redefined not as a class category and not really as an identity as much as a practice. Would you say that? Or?
No, I think that, okay, the word class sometimes is used inside certain debate, but because the background is the kind of background that I mentioned before. But in terms of the way through which you take a word, the way you say something, no, it's contadino. It's being a peasant, not being working class, let's say, or one class against the other. It's more one practice alternative to other practices. This is, much more the way through which there is a politicization of practices of ecological care, for example. And for example, in the case of Mondeggi, it's, we know, commons as an alternative to both private and public idea of property, and of course there is this in Mondeggi, and there is self-management of the place and the creation of new relations around agroecology, people involved there, people in the villages around. There are all of this, but you can't understand really Mondeggi without connecting commons from one side and ecology for the other. And we are a bit more in the eco-commons, no? It's part of what they are doing, transforming the way through which you are cultivating olive trees and the way through which you are pruning them. It's the core of the project, making better and better level of soil there, no? The organic substance in the soil there. is deeply part of the project organizing in another way a farm that was shaped with the idea of the industrial and very productivism idea of agriculture in the last decades. So it's really a reparative dimension of agroecology there, and it's very material because it's deeply related to creating another social context, of course, and this is a bit the idea of the commons, but here is eco-commoning. They started to call since the beginning that place as a place of emergent commons. And this emerged not only through the relation amongst people doing nice things together, but also with the relation with the lands and the material dimension of making ecological care there. So this is deeply part of the engagement of Mondegi Commons.
So there are commons and there are people renting the land and people who own the land, I could imagine. Do you have any sense of what the composition is in those terms of different forms of, right of use, ownership and so on? Yeah.
Well, this is very dishomogeneous because the right to the land in Italy, it's very, very different, region by region. It's very, very different how far you are to big cities, for example. No? So still in Italy, you have the possibility to buy for very, very few money a farm with land in many, for example, all around all the Apennini. It's from the north to the south. Yeah, it's very easy. But then, it's easier to buy something in economic terms, sometimes, but not always. There are very, very nice exceptions. More is difficult, create a cultural, political, economical network that make your own experience sustainable, Because one thing is self-organized marketing in Bologna and in Florence, but the right to the land close to the city in Florence and Bologna, it's a bit difficult, if you don't have very luckily familiar or whatever contingent connection. But in Italy, it's still possible to buy land, also in a very beautiful place, I have to say. But sometimes there are places where it's a bit more difficult, but not impossible. Create the kind of cultural context in which you have your own market, you sell your own thing, you make your own cultural event connected with food in the countryside and in small villages. But there are also examples of this. So I have to say, that's not impossible, let's say, to buy a farm, and it depends where. Well, I think in other countries it's difficult everywhere. I mean, I don't know, in England, I don't know a cheap place in England where you can. No, in Italy, and also because we are living in Italy, and in Italy, you had historically many waves of people being urbanized. So it's full of land without people. Full of places without people, and also renting is someone bought the land, but also renting is very common. We are renting the situation in which we are, and many others are renting. It's quite common. Yeah, well, it's difficult to say in terms of percent.
Andrea is mentioning two really important aspects of what makes it sustainable to have this kind of back to the land movement and articulation with urban movements. And one is access to land, which, as he's saying, in regions of Italy is quite affordable. Another is the capacity to build social networks of solidarity and collaboration with other farmers and with people in the cities in those regions. And that differs from region to region. Another thing that's really important is the capacity to influence institutions. He's already mentioned that in the region of Tuscany, the movement was strong enough and the political situation was open enough for GeniunoClandestino to be a part of rewriting the law about processed food. But in the pandemic, it's been even more clear how important it is. So in episode 2, we've heard about the ways in which farmers' markets in Romania were shut down in the early phases of the pandemic, but supermarkets were not. And Andrea told us it's the same in Italy. So there's a question of the political capacities of the movement to lobby and to kind of impose its own agenda, its own needs, its own interests. So we talked a little bit, Andrea and I, about how public institutions are shaping the terrain of GeniunoClandestino, but also how GeniunoClandestino can think about influencing politics.
We are in a situation where thinking food differently is not only necessarily, but we have a rising awareness of the people of how much is relevant food and ecological care and agroecology, and creating network of alternative and transformative economies also between the city and the countryside. But I think that in general, the peasants' movement and the farmers' movement in Italy is not able to construct a semiotics or a public argument about that. So it's not able to intervene about the money arriving from Europe connected to ecological transition. So at best, what you are able to do is make a strong critique that what the government is doing, or you don't say nothing, or you say that with 6, 7 different positions, but you are not at the level to say, oh no, we want that money for doing that kind of stuff, for reinforcing the markets, for giving space for the solidarity economy groups, for a range. So there's not an idea, okay, how public institution can make a role in making agroecology more sustainable. How public institution and institution of proximity in the neighborhood, in the cities, in the municipality, they allow space and money for making sustainable the relation between poor people in the neighborhood, the access of good food. So we are zero from that. The capacity to intervene in a very difficult situation made us also weaker than before in our capacity to have a voice in the public debates. So we are speaking about very nice everyday practices, but not often these practices are capable to being present in a public debate and intervene politically also at the institutional level. Yeah.
So a final question to you, not as a member of GeniunoClandestino, but as someone who thinks about the political possibilities of the present and have done through many years in the context of different movements. What are the political horizons that you see of agrarian movements that are articulating the struggles with urban life and so on? What are the broader implications beyond GeniunoClandestino that you see?
For staying to the Italian context, we have been in the last 10, 12 years very significant local movement on the territorial struggles. So, not have movement in Val di Susa is very famous, but literally, if you go from the north to Sicily, you will map an insane amount of local struggle about the quality of the air, against the construction of a new airport, against the proliferation of very expensive trains and the cut of the local public transportation that people use for going to work every day. So you will map an insane amount of local struggle with many, many people involved. Struggles that sometimes won, sometimes no. Struggles that were able to generate a continuity of action and organization as not have movement for 30 years, had a struggle that maybe erupted and lasted 1 year and then that's it. So I think this is one level of ecological engagement that was very significant in the last 10, 12 years, and at the same time rarely was able to create a space of political coordination. This is a layer. Another layer is the extraordinary dimension that the political prism of climate change is producing as an open question, as a very concrete issue, is producing in a new generation of activism. What we have seen with Extinction Rebellion, and even more with Fridays for Future in 2018, 2019 in Italy, has been very, very relevant in terms of people engaged in the street, in how significant, especially in the high school, but also sometimes in the university, was relevant the strikes of that kind of movement, how through the question of climate change, a series of condition, ecological and social dimension of life are put in question in a way, no? So the question of climate change as a prism through which many debates are opened through new generation of activism, and this was very strong in 2018 and even more 2019. I don't know if here the situation is still good now, but it's an open question. But this is another layer. A third very significant layer, connected with that, there is also the fact that in the university in the last 3-4 years, activism in the university took an ecological turn in many ways. I mean, in Italy we had in the last 4 years at least 12, 13, 14 different new collectives in different universities of the country that emerged directly as collettivi di ecologia politica. Collective of political ecology, and most part of them doing intervention in the urban spaces, more or less connected with the university, and they are dealing self-organized self-education program for introducing in the university all these kind of topics and debates, and so it's a very relevant thing. And I was mentioning, the third layer is something that include new peasantries, agroecology, but also other stuff. And it's an ecologism of everyday life, very connected with practices. Practices that sometimes are capable also of creating other infrastructures, as in the case. I mean, we can speak about all the experiment related to money, the relation with alternative economies, which is a strong thing in Italy. I mean, gas, group of solidarity purchase, is still a relevant thing in the country. Many people are connected with them. There is also strong legacy of the anti-globalization movement connecting with developing alternative economies in the countries, but also connect people that are coming from different cultural backgrounds. Some of them are very deep involved in the structure of, left Catholicism in the country. Others of them comes more from the traditional left, others from the new left, and so on and so forth. And I can say, agroecology, new peasantries, transformative economies, very connected with the ecological question, all of them, of course, but also transition towns, which something is emerging also here, and taking place also, starting arguing in the villages and the towns about the politics of the municipality, or inventing place where there is a remaking of things, reutilizing things, sharing things, banks of time, that kind of activism, which is significant, I think. So we can say we have these 3 layers that in Italy potentially can create a space for politicizing the question of ecology in broader and wider terms. And then, for example, we had Ni Una Menos in Italy. It was very strong in the last 8-9 years in Italy, Ni Una Menos. And Ni Una Menos was able to connect different kinds of feminism or everyday practices or forms of politics around the idea of Ni Una Menos, and offering a space that was habitable for different ways of being feminism or queer people or whatever, but at the same time open also to new people that through that kind of model of organization found a way of to be engaged. This was very relevant. But we didn't have something similar with the eco dimension, no? And I was mentioning these 3 layers because they are potentially, I think that as much as we have occasions to connect the everyday food that we are eating, the climate change situation, the transformative economy, the capacity to create all together or in different groups alternative infrastructure of life, but at the same time also the capacity to intervene in the more institutional articulation of power, in the institution of proximity, and so on and so forth, that is a kind of possible space that will make a connection between very big issues as climate change and very everyday experience of being in connection with other people or in connection with land or in connection with a neighborhood. Yeah, so I think one dimension is this, trying to create something that may eco-politics, something perceived as the invitation to think different ways of doing politics relevant amongst each other and offering a public space habitable also for other people to be involved is one thing. The other thing is the relation with Niuna in terms of both these movements are posing clearly the question of alternatives in eco-social reproduction. So we had some good moments of debate with Niuna di Menos. Also there it depends territory by territory, it's not all the time the same. And it is still an open possibility, especially in COVID time, for taking serious thinking politics through this question rather than others. And yeah. So this is a bit more in terms of which kind of subjectivity can emerge from the mixing or merging or creating new coalition and that kind of idea. In terms of political imaginary, for me, the question is trying to mix together alternatives in everyday life with also the capacity to create autonomous infrastructure that are able to sustain really this experience, make autonomy durable also in terms of time. And the third one is the question of reopen a bit the space of negotiation also with traditional politics, which is very difficult for many reasons now in Italy, but I think we need also a bit the capacity to think in power in another way and intervene also at that level of articulation, because we need that. We need for making sustainable all the other things that I was mentioning until now.
It's nice to hear what Andrea is saying about this new generation of ecological struggle being present across so many fields and dimensions in Italy, and how a very young generation is getting also increasingly involved in this, bringing together also feminism, climate struggle, agriculture, and so on, anti-racist struggle, and so on. This is obviously also what we are trying to do here. And this question of land, the commons, and collective forms of agriculture that link to this back to the land movements of younger generations make me think also of movements like the Acker-Syndikat in Germany, which also works to collectively reclaim land for collective agricultural practices, inspired by the commons-based housing model of the Mietshäuser-Syndikat. So we see many, many alliances there. And obviously the question of legal forms of the commons, but also struggles of the commons are really key here. And these common struggles, they have different histories and focuses in different countries. In our links that go with this episode, we're going to be attaching some texts and resources to give a bit of an insight into this extremely broad spectrum of this extremely broad and rich spectrum of Italian commons struggles, which have a very specific legal focus to a large extent, because there have been these pushes towards legal frameworks concerning public law, but also private law.
I think an important subtext of what Andrea is talking about are two tensions within the agroecological movement and peasant movements more broadly. One is how do you relate to science and tradition? How do you articulate traditional farming methods with science? Or some people would make a claim for how do you affirm traditions against science? It's a clear tension within the movement and something that really has taken a kind of difficult and problematic turn with the pandemic, in which, of course, there are many people who are taking this kind of traditionalist anti-science approach who are opponents of vaccines, etc., and others who are not. And this is a really very real tension in the movement and something that has to be addressed. And the way Andrea is opening for doing this is to say we have to take science seriously and articulate it with existing knowledges and knowledges that often predate in industrial farming. And another tension is that between a kind of purist localism and a politics that also tries to influence institutions, legislation, and perhaps form its own forms of autonomous institutions. And that's another thing that's clearly playing out in Italy and in agroecological movements elsewhere, especially within the kind of back to the land movement, where a lot of people will affirm a strong localism, and others will, like Andrea is doing here, will suggest that this localism is simply unsustainable unless there are institutional transformations, and that this kind of these rich local ecologies and solidarities have to be connected up to a broader horizon of institutional change, as well as an internationalism of migrant solidarity and of connecting to peasant struggles in other countries, as well as urban struggles against, for instance, this kind of capitalist productivism and its broader destructive dynamics in terms of climate, in terms of ecologies, and so on. So let's keep these tensions and contradictions in mind.
I think another really important thing that Andrea mentioned was this question that organic and healthy food should be accessible to everyone. This is one of the major challenges, of course, for agroecological and organic and small-scale food production, to be able to sell beyond a small market of relatively privileged consumers. And we've tried to point to different ways that struggles are trying to find out of this paradox. In our last episode, we mentioned how the issue of rents can be articulated or could be articulated with the question of how much we want to be paying for food. So on and on we go, thinking about this unresolved issue here. But for sure in this episode, again, we've seen some of the kinds of alliances that will be key to making that transformation happen.
These are often very concrete, practical questions, how to make the food available and accessible to people. One is to cut out middlemen, supermarket chains, etc., who are taking a profit off the good. Having a direct contact between producers and consumers is one thing. Another is having the availability of food happen in open markets where the people who have stalls don't have to pay rent or minimal contributions to the running of the market, which allows for cheaper goods. And a final one is to allow them to sell as much of their produce as possible, because if you cannot do processed foods out of your unsold tomatoes, for instance, you have to make a higher price on the tomatoes in the first instance. Whereas if you could take the tomatoes you haven't sold on market day and process them into a tomato sauce, your produce will reach longer and you'll be able to overall make it available at a cheaper price.
So on this wonderful note of tomato sauce, which might have made some stomachs rumble, we will close this episode. As always, follow us on Twitter at Earthcare Radio. Check out our SoundCloud account for links associated with this episode. And stay tuned for many more wonderful episodes in the future.